I'm Trebor Scholz. Welcome, everybody. And we will just have a really brief introduction of the speakers at tweet lengths, as we decided, so no endless biographies. You can find them in the program. We will talk about the future of workers in the sharing economy. We will start with Tom Slee, who is a technology, somebody who's working in the technology industry and is also a blogger and a writer. Yeah, is that the right description?
Yeah, fair enough.
And he will be followed by Denise Cheng, who is well, how do we say, a researcher affiliated with MIT, and who is very interested in the sharing economy and wrote her thesis on the sharing economy. She will be followed by Leonard, who was for 18 years a writer for Salon.com and is now with Medium. So he wants to be introduced as a freshly minted member of the Precariat. Lastly, we have Arun, who is a professor at NYU, just a block from here, who is researching the digital economy. So we're starting with Tom Slee, and we will have these presentations first, and then in the end we will have discussions. So hold your questions till the end. And you should probably also know, just for privacy reasons, that this session is live streamed.
So my name's Tom Slee, and so this is my presentation. So what we've been asked to talk about is the future of workers in the sharing economy, but I'm going to split my half hour into two sections of about 15 minutes each. So the first section is going to be looking at, I thought if we're going to talk about the future of the sharing economy, we should talk about what it is now, and it's something that's changing so quickly that I thought I'd take the first part just to say, well, what is this thing and what does it look like now? And then when I look into the future, certainly if the architects of the sharing economy, if it plays out the way they would like, then reputation is going to be an absolute key to the future of workers in that area. And so the second half of what I say will be about reputation and how that works or doesn't work. I guess that's a bit of a spoiler on what I think of it, but there you go. So just so that you know, this thing that just crashed on me just now, so this is not quite a regular slide deck. This is what we call IPython notebook, which is, so it's either the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds. This is a literate programming tool, so it means that you can mix text and video and a bit of code. The main thing from your point of view is that it should make this a little more interactive, and I can do things on the fly rather than just slides. So let's start off with the sharing economy as it is now. And I thought maybe one way to look at what it is to look at the group Peers, which is the group that's supporting the sharing economy. And Peers has about 75 partner organizations that are affiliated with it. And so those partner organizations should make kind of a proxy for what the sharing economy as a whole is like. So here's what they look like. And the nice thing is there's all different kinds of things here. So you've got groups to do with food, exchanging food. You've got transport, so that's, all the car sharing people. You've got pets, you've got education, all kinds of stuff, right? So, so that's one way of looking at it. You can also look, in terms of location, California is where most of these are. There's some in New York State. And then I've done the American exceptionalism thing, done some by states and then the rest by countries. But you'll see there's like Denmark, there's Belgium, there's Turkey. So it's kind of a global phenomenon, right, is the point I'm trying to make there. Another one you might want to think of is, to break it down, so it's mainly commercial, right? There are some non-profits and a couple of media things, but the way I've broken it down, it's pretty much all a commercial thing. So this is a startup thing based around digital technologies. So let's go back to the area thing again. But now let's look at that a different way. And instead of looking at just how many organizations, let's look at how the dollars divided up, because this is a commercial thing after all. And then we see a little bit of a different picture, right? So hospitality takes a lot of money, and basically that's Airbnb, right? Transport takes a lot of money. And that's basically Lyft, because Uber is not a member of peers, so it doesn't appear here. If Uber was included, that would be humongous. Education is kind of an odd one. I'm not going to talk about that at all. Services is sort of the TaskRabbit, HomeJoy cleaning service, errand running things. And then there's a bunch of little ones. But you can see that most of the money is going into a fairly small number of areas. And let's look at location as well. Well, that's pretty clear, isn't it? So this is a Silicon Valley movement, I think, right? You can see that pretty much right off. So Silicon Valley with a few fairly big players. So the point about this that I want to say is that we can look at the sharing economy in many ways, but what I want to do is look at these leading lights because they are setting the template for how the rest are going to go. So we have the Airbnb of this, the Uber and that. So let me take a little look. What kind of thing is Airbnb? What kind of thing is Uber? That's the question that I want to ask. So let's start off with Airbnb. And if there's two things you know, one thing is probably the origin story. Two guys, design a conference, didn't have enough money to make the rent, put together a few airbeds, rented them out. Hey, maybe there's some business here. And off they go, right? So this very idea that you can take airbeds, share a room, all very casual, and scale it up to a multi-billion-dollar business. And the second thing, the line that they use most often now is that Airbnb is about regular people sharing the home in which they live. Now, I'm a jaded cynic, so I thought, well, let's take a look at this and let's take some numbers. So I started poking around their site, and obviously that wasn't getting me very far. So I wrote myself a little program to go and pull things off the Airbnb website. And so I've got a few 100,000 listings now in different cities, and I can see what the Airbnb business looks like. So here's an interesting thing. When you book a room on Airbnb, you can choose one of three types. You can say, I want to share a room, and that's the original airbed model, right? Yeah, you have an airbed, over there it is, that's it. The other is a private room in someone's place of residence, right? And that, I think, is what we mostly think of as Airbnb. You know, people coming in, you see the pictures, you know, sharing dinner together, it's that personal experience. And then the third thing is you can rent out someone's entire home or apartment, right? So in that case, that's just like renting a place. So the interesting thing here is that only 3.2% in New York of the listings are actually the shared rooms, right? So not very much at all. And in fact, that's just looking at it by listings. If you look at it by visits, it's even less. And you'll see now that the private rooms are about 40% and the entire homes are about just over 50%. Keep your eye on those numbers. Let's have a look at the income that comes in from those. Well, obviously, entire homes tend to take more, and you know, the others tend to take less. So 3/4 of the business is renting out entire homes, right? And a tiny little sliver there is renting out shared rooms. And this is the case. So this is New York, which is the first city I looked at. But, you know, it's pretty much the same anywhere. So let's look at Berlin, even more so. Let's look at Barcelona. There you go. Let's look at San Francisco. You know, it's basically the same everywhere you go. So when we're thinking about the sharing economy, let's be clear what it is. It's not airbeds, right? That's the first message. So the second thing I want to say is this. There's that phrase, regular people sharing, you know, renting out the room in the place in which they live. So I thought, well, being jaded again, let's look at this, and let's look at single listers and multiple listers. Let's look at the hosts and see where they go. So this does two things. One is that it actually fits. So this is from the data that I collected in New York, and it absolutely fits what Airbnb says about its own host thing, which is that 87% of them are people who just have one place to live, right? Renting out the place in which they live. Single listers. The other 12% have more than one listing on the site, right? So that's fair enough. But then, of course, that's only one way of looking at that. What if instead of breaking it down by hosts, we break it down by listings? So, of course, the ones who have multiple listings have more, right? So obviously that's going to be bigger. So instead of 12%, we're now talking just over 1/4 of Airbnb's business is coming from multiple listing hosts. So that's interesting. What about the number of visits? And I should say here, visits, I mean, it's an estimate, because I can't see who's visiting who, but you can see the number of reviews on the site, so I pick it up from that. Well, it's even more. So 40% of Airbnb's business is coming from that kind of thing. And if we look income-wise, it's about the same in Europe. So again, although we're told that it's all about regular people renting out their place, 40% of the business comes from people renting out multiple places. So, and let's just take a look again. How does that look around the world? Barcelona, it's far more. It's more, over half people doing Oddly enough, Paris, which you would think would be more like Barcelona, is more single. I don't know why that is, but there you go. And so you can look around the place and see what's going on. So the point I wish to make here is this, that when you get the picture of what the sharing economy is like, that Airbnb is being economical with the truth. So most of its money comes from whole home and apartment rentals. About half of it comes from people with multiple listings. And we've seen this story before, right? We've seen it, typically see it in the sort of what you might call the disruptive sector. It's a website. It's very easy to put things on there. So you get all kinds of stuff. You get some people who are doing a lot of business and some people who are doing no business at all. So you can count this and talk about this story in multiple ways. And when Amazon was becoming a big thing, everyone talked about the self-publishing and the little guy and the long tail. And with Airbnb, they want to talk about people in their homes and authenticity and real people making a little extra money and all that. But there's always another side to this story. And, with Amazon now, it's all about the big publishers to some extent, fighting with those. And with Airbnb, there is this other half. So they talk about one half to justify the other. It's not that they're lying. Everything they said, that so far as I've been able to see, is reasonably true. But they are making it up a bit. But I'm not going to have time here. So you can only win, but that's statistics, right? So I want to say a little bit about else. I want to say a little bit about, I'm a lucky person. My birth family lives in the UK. I got to go back there last year. My sister and I went to see Rome. So we got to spend some time there. It was lovely. We stayed in an apartment. It wasn't an Airbnb one, but so there's my sister in an area called Trastevere, which is one of the places that we had, which we liked the most. So it's not where all the big sites are. Trastevere means across the river. And it's so some of you will know it. It's sort of full of cobbled streets, and it's a beautiful little place and lovely little restaurants, as you saw. But it's also the site for conflicts over gentrification because, of course, tourism is a mixed thing for many places. It brings in money, but it has this problem of gentrification. So this is the story of gentrification and conflict in Trastevere. A lot is built around this one building, a cinema called the Cinema America, which opened back in '56. But when they closed it, the new owners wanted to take it down and put up a parking lot. So people went into occupation on that, as the song says, and so that's carried on. So there's obviously there's issues in Trastevere. So let's have a look at Airbnb in Rome, which is, after all, the point of this. So these are the Airbnb rentals in Rome, and there's about 8,000 of them. And so you can see it sort of goes out in this way. So there's the 7 hills of Rome, which sort of divide them up. And so what I want to do is, I want to look at what is the most rented place in Rome. And again, this is a rough thing, but here's the apartment, which, from what I can tell, has taken the most money of any in Rome. And, shock horror, it's in Trastevere. You'll be surprised to hear. So let's have a look at that apartment and see what it is. So there it is. It's a lovely place. Only $610 a night. And let's look at the host. A lot of people have stayed there. I want to go a little further here. I want to see the full profile. So regular people living out the home in which they live, except he lives in Austin, Texas, and he's a tech entrepreneur. But he's had 237 reviews, and he's an Airbnb superhost. So this is the kind of person they want. He went to Harvard, and he has 3 listings. So one of which is this nobleman's loft, which is lovely. The other is the ultimate panoramic Rome penthouse, which I'm sure is also lovely. And the other is his seaplane cabin on any European lake based in Barcelona. So, you know, are they all like this? Well, no, of course not. But it is a matter of choosing which story to tell. Now, am I about 15 minutes in? Yeah? I don't want to say, I'll try to rush through. The other piece of this is Uber, also very good at presenting figures that make sense and selected figures. The biggest number that they've put out is this one, and this is just what I want to spend. So the median income on Uber, this was in July of this year, on UberX is more than $90,000 a year per driver in New York and more than $74,000 a year per driver in San Francisco. So this number, I was actually oddly enough at a conference in New York at the time, and I was talking to the tech journalist Nancy Scholz, who's a wonderful person, if I can drop names, and she said she was looking at this on Twitter and she could see the feed go by, mentions of this number. Just everyone picked up on it. So the Washington Post says, maybe this is the end of poorly paid cab drivers. And of course, cab drivers are poorly paid. I mean, it's a terrible industry to be in. Maybe Uber's $90,000 salary could disrupt the taxi business. Hey, you're qualified to drive a car but not professionally doing it. Congratulations, you're making a $90,000 a year average Uber salary. So let's take a look at this. First, you know, let's just ask if it's so. So Alison Griswold, who works for Slate, has been doing this for a long time. She's done a lot of work on Uber, and she says, well, I've yet to come across a single driver earning this amount. So there is that question, but even so, let's take it up. Here's how Uber breaks down its money. It says of any, I want to ask about where that money goes. Let's just assume that they're right about it. So what they say is you pay 20%, I've got lease, but this means 20% of the money goes to Uber, 5% goes to gas, 3.7 goes to, you know, ongoing expenses of running your car, and the rest is yours. So 70% of 90,000 is, you know, 63,000, so that's pretty sweet. So that looks pretty good. I want you to try to remember this breakdown because I just want to look at how it breaks down for taxi drivers. There's a lot of comparisons, a lot of complexity. We don't have time to go. So here's the interesting thing. Of the dollar of fare, right? So breaking down the same way. First, I mean, if there's an enemy in the taxi industry that we can all agree is sort of the medallion owners. But the medallion owners' share here is this bit, which is actually less than Uber takes out, right? So it's 16.7%. Uber takes out 20% at least. But then look at how the rest is divided up. 20% is a far more reasonable number for operation and depreciation of the car you're doing. Gas is more like 20% and others. So basically, the drivers end up walking away with far less than you might say. So, and this is from a report that, you know, you look up a couple of city reports, it's not that hard to find. San Diego, pretty much the same, about 30% of what you pay goes to the taxi driver, the rest gets spread around depreciation, the amount that goes to gas and all the rest. The final one I looked at was Toronto. So again, that division is much more split up. And again, here they're saying about just over 20% of what you pay will actually go to the driver. So the figures that Uber is doing, I mean, they're just ignoring all the factors that go into running a car when you're driving 66, 70 hours a week, as both the taxi drivers and the Uber drivers are doing. So since then, we've seen a lot of fare cuts. We've seen a lot of things going on since then. Uber's increased its own cut. And the end result that I want to pick up on here is that this myth of the well-paid Uber driver is falling to pieces, I think. Now the numbers that come out only slightly higher than the average pay per hour of yellow cab taxis in New York, and that doesn't even factor the cost of vehicles or its maintenance. So Uber drivers are having problems, and we should remember that when we talk about the sharing economy. So that's my bit about the sharing economy and what it stands. So how long have I got? 5 minutes? Okay, so I'm going to have to rush through reputation. What am I going to do here? The promise of the sharing economy is that reputation systems, let me go back up to this, can replace companies and can replace regulations. That's the promise they make. this is my sophisticated drawing from this morning. So we can have on the left, you've got what you might call a traditional world. So we have non-commercial interactions that are peer-to-peer, and there's a tie between, do I trust you? If so, then, then we go along. Or you've got other places, if you go to McDonald's, not that you do, but if you did, then you don't really, someone makes that food for you, but you don't really trust them. What you do is you trust McDonald's. You're in a relationship with McDonald's. McDonald's controls its employees, and so things work out. That's the plan. So the question is, when it comes to the sharing economy, is it the top one, where you've got basically peer-to-peer, lightly sprinkled with a little bit of platform, or is it the bottom one, where the platform owners are increasingly exerting control? So is it this kind of thing, peer-to-peer, or is it that kind of thing, where you've got customer to platform owner to... So let's take a look. So I guess if I was going to say anything here, I'd say, the sharing economy claim is that it's taking us from this world here of companies and regulation up to the top right. Now there's a world of peer-to-peer. And I would argue that we're going a different way. We're taking things that have typically been outside the mainstream market economy at the top left, we're putting into it, and it's going to end up down here. So that's my fancy diagram. So reputation and trust is clearly a big thing for these people. So this is David Brooks in the New York Times. Companies like Airbnb establish trust through ratings mechanisms. Thomas Friedman, Airbnb's real innovation is a platform of trust. You rate each other and it works out, right? Brian Chesky, who's the CEO of Airbnb, says, cities can't screen as well as technologies can screen, because companies have these magical things called reputation systems, which is an odd phrase from a tech guy, but hey. So let's have a look at reputation systems. Here is Yelp makes available a data set that people can mess with. And this is what we expect reputation systems to look like, right? You expect it, you've got a sprinkling of things. So that's the distribution of rating for bars. Most at 3, 3.5, 4, but a distribution across. So you can say, probably this isn't very good. Probably this is pretty good. It lets you discriminate among the different things. So we can look at other things. If we look at the restaurants, there's a lot of those. Again, it's the same kind of thing, right? So that's the way it looks. So then I thought, well, let's take a look at how this works when people are rating each other. So I went to the BlaBlaCar website, which is, people driving each other across France, and sort of downloaded 500,000 ratings there, and looked at the distribution, and this is what it looks like. Everything is 5 stars, right? So it goes up to 500,000 there. A few ones, because people are pissed off because someone didn't turn up, and that's basically it. So the key thing here is, what's going on when people are rating things? The designers might like to think that what it is that you're evaluating each other, right? Trebor does something, it's like, well, that's pretty good, but it wasn't that great, so I'll give you a 3. That's not what's going on. What people do is naturally, it's a courtesy thing. If you stayed in a bed and breakfast and you leave, there's a guest book. You don't say, well, the breakfast was kind of so. You say, thanks, that was great. And that's what people do, naturally. They engage in courtesy. Say, thank you, Trebor. That was fantastic. Off we go. So the thing here is, then, what that means is the reputation system doesn't discriminate among any of the transactions that are going on, right? It is useless as a way of establishing trust. And Airbnb has pretty much the same thing. These are Airbnb ratings. Again, they use a 5-star system. So in Toronto, pretty much everything is 4.5 or 5 stars, right? So Toronto's a polite kind of place, but New York, people are a bit more plain about their opinions. But it's the same, right? You can look anywhere. It's the same. 4.5, 5 stars, pretty much everything. So these reputation systems, they're not doing what they know. And this is not new. This was known on eBay back in 2002. And if people are ticked off, what do? Well, if you think about it a minute, you just don't say anything. You walk away. You say, all right, I'm off. And you just go away. So it covers up some of the dissatisfaction that is there on the platform, because when people have bad experiences, they don't talk about it. They just go away. So the reason I said unplug now is because you don't want to see. That's the end of the diagrams and stuff. But I still have some speaker notes that I want to pull on. So why would you do a useless system? And the reason is that it's a complaints mechanism. It is, I was talking to a guy called Ed Lake who works for Eon magazine. And he described it as a denunciation system. And that's exactly right. You're not giving information to it's not giving information from one peer to another. It's giving information about your experience to the platform owner. So on Lyft and Uber, if you slip below the 4.5, 4.6 star rating out of 7, you are off that platform. And if you bought that car with Uber's co-financing arrangement with Santander Bank and GM, well, too bad you, because you have no claim on that, right? So it's a way, who gets to have a say then? Well, the most demanding customers get to have a say, right? Everyone else is going to give you 5 stars. The ones you want to watch out for are the really demanding people, because they're the ones who might complain about you and get you kicked off the system. So what that does is it builds a workforce that is built around, you know, what we call emotional labor, affective labor, the kind of thing where you're for fear of being kicked off, you have to behave like you love what you're doing and present it and be smiling. But in the end, this is establishing trust through surveillance, right? This is people surveying. This isn't a rating system. This is the sticker on the back of the truck saying, you know, how's my driving? It's a complaint mechanism. The other thing is that it does is it's a front for other aspects of the discipline system that the companies have put in place. They have realized over time this is not good enough. You have a few bad things in Airbnb and things are going to go south, right? So what they've done instead is they built in other things. So if you want to be a super host like Martin, you not only have to have a good reputation, which pretty much everyone is going to have, but you have to follow certain rules that Airbnb sets out, right? You have to respond to requests within a short time. You have to do this, you have to do that. And you have to maintain a certain level of traffic. And if you don't do that, you're going to slip down the search rankings all of a sudden. If you're Uber, then they can say, by the way, you have to take 90% of the calls that get pushed your way, right? Otherwise, you know, you're off. Or in one case that recently that came up, there's a suggestion that someone got kicked off because they tweeted bad things about the company. Right? So this is the kind of thing, if you're a TaskRabbit, if you want to be elite, it means you have to abide by the policies that companies put out. So this is not, again, this is not peer-to-peer reputation. What this is brownie points. Right? This is a brownie point system. Because platform owners have to establish their own brand with customers. Airbnb does not want you renting from Trebor. They want you renting from Airbnb. They want you to trust Airbnb. So that's what's going on. So there are a number of ways of thinking about this. I'm just about done, right? So if you want to think about ways of thinking about this, you know, Alice Marwick has said a lot about this, and she's talking somewhere else in this conference right now, sadly, because I'd love to hear what she has to say, that it encourages a world of self-presentation, self-branding, in Foucault's words. I got to use the word Foucault in a presentation. And, or it's Ali Hochschild's thing about emotional labor. The way I like to see it is James C. Scott's thing, the seeing like a state, that this is a system that simplifies reputation and requires of people that they make themselves legible to the system, right? And so that you have to give up all your information to them in order to be able to play in these kind of systems. I think I'm going to have to stop there, except to say that in the future, there are plans that the idea that your reputation will be useful not only on one platform, but you'll be able to take that from, say, you know, from say, Homejoy, and then use it on another one. It's something that people are actively investigating. So your reputation score will go with you as your kind of personal resume, whether you like it or not. And what that means is it provides an illusion of control, but I think what's going to happen is that it becomes, it becomes a mechanism of control where you no longer have control over your own history. You have to trade it away in order to get work. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll talk about other things afterwards. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Denise Cheng. I recently finished up at the MIT Center for Civic Media and the Comparative Media Studies program. Right now I'm an independent contractor and consultant, so a freelancer along with some of my co-panelists. But actually I wanted to give a little bit more of my background just so you understand where I'm coming from. Very broadly speaking, I have a community organizing background. I've worked on digital divide issues, media justice, basically a lot of things to do with civic engagement. So that'll be a little bit of the framing of what I'm about to present. So I'm currently independent and I work mostly with cities and foundations, but for my master's work, what I really wanted to explore was how to build a worker support infrastructure around the peer economy. And the peer economy are groups like Etsy, Lyft, Getaround, Kitchen Surfing, TaskRabbit, HomeJoy, well, actually, maybe not HomeJoy, but like a lot of these platforms, and you probably recognize a few of them, but really, really simply speaking, what they are, they're online platforms that enable people to monetize skills and assets that they already have. So the work that I've been doing is really an inquiry into how to improve the worker experience given the constraints. So my work actually doesn't really start from whether peer-to-peer marketplaces are particularly ethical, because to me, that's kind of moot. The answer, whatever it is, it doesn't change that they're here already. So in my mind, the real key is to actually figure out how to get out in front of them. So what I'm going to give you today are actually a few examples of areas that I feel like need a lot more research in order to design grounded interventions. I'm going to start by sharing a few of my findings when I was doing my master's research. I took an ethnographic approach. I did a scan of literature, history, mostly starting from the 1800s. I talked to a lot of different stakeholders, including venture capitalists, scholars, companies, city employees, consultants, labor advocates, and of course, the most important being providers. I was a participant observer in some of these instances, and in others, I did one-on-one interviews, focus group interviews, and all of my research took place between 2012 to 2014. I'm still doing a lot of research around this, but here are a few things that I learned. So for some people, peer-to-peer marketplaces provide an opportunity to get skills training or to add bulk to a resume. So this is Margot. She's a really, really capable designer. She's also a freelancer. And she's on a platform called Skillshare, which is actually based in New York. And so Skillshare is a peer-to-peer learning platform where people can create video course packages. And back in 2013, Skillshare was trying to brand itself. It really wanted to be the peer-to-peer learning platform if you wanted to learn about design or technology. And they started courting people like Guy Kawasaki, a few other brand names in design and tech, and they asked Margot to actually create a few of their video courses. So Margot pulled together a few design courses, and she gets money whenever somebody enrolls in that class. What she does is she also lists her participation on Skillshare, so the classes that she actually has on there, she lists them as part of her online portfolio. So if you look her up, you'll always see a link to that. And also, when an enrollment period starts, she also tweets about it. And in a sense, what she's really signaling to other designers here is, hey, I'm an expert. Look at me, I have a course, right? So there are other examples of this. I interviewed some people before TaskRabbit really, really changed. And one woman who I talked to actually used it as a platform to train herself in event management. She was in an AmeriCorps program, and AmeriCorps ends after a certain period of time, and so she started using TaskRabbit far more aggressively, and her involvement led her to this thing that she didn't know she would enjoy. And now she feels really comfortable listing that as part of her resume. I've also met a woman who, during that same period, using TaskRabbit, she actually had quit her full-time job, wasn't quite ready to go and find another full-time job, and what she really wanted to see was different cultural workplaces. So that's what she got to do by participating on TaskRabbit. Oh, sorry, resume. So one of the things that I also did was I looked at a few labor movements, mostly domestic workers, franchises, and franchise regulation, which really there's actually not that much around that. And the history of the common law of agency and the economic realities test. And probably a lot of people in this room know that those are the two tests that determine whether you're an employee or an independent contractor in the US. So I've also talked to a lot of labor advocates, and between talking to labor advocates and reading the literature, what became really clear to me is that a lot of the worker rights narrative is basically around trying to get people recognized as employees. So sometimes that's worked. With the case of FedEx, for example, a lot of people were protesting to be recognized as independent or as employees rather than independent contractors who had bid on a route. So these are truck drivers. In this particular case in Massachusetts, the court found in their favor and said that FedEx had way too much control. But actually, this whole FedEx thing has been going on for 10 years. So this thing has actually been brought up again and again across several states, across many different independent contractors, and actually sometimes FedEx has won. So the big thing about this is that if this is the only strategy to be recognized as an employee, we're really clinging to that, and it just can't be a strategy forever. So I'm going to come back a little bit to, can I just take this off? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this donut hole idea a little bit later, but right now I'm just going to tell you that not everybody gets the same satisfaction out of participating on these marketplaces. But here are a few reasons that people participate. They need the money. It can be sociable for some people. It is income security in case you might lose your main gig. You can count on it for some sort of income, regardless of how much, right? It's constant, it's steady. And it's a supplement. You could put it into your savings, you could put it into your retirement, it could be pocket money. One woman I talked to who rents out her home on Airbnb, or rents out extra rooms in her home in particular, it's what actually allows her to live by herself. She's an older woman, and she was saying to me that, she said, I'm a mature woman who needs my space, which I thought was really nice. And so it's also that it's flexible. One person I talked to who was a driver, he was a shuttle driver, right? He used to work the evening shift, the night shift, and because of that, he actually didn't really have a good chance to see his kids. So he made a lateral move to become an Uber driver because, in a sense, for him, at the end of the day, the pay was about the same. But what it did allow him to do was invest time where it had the most meaning to him, which was his family. For some people, it's also an outlet for creativity. Etsy is usually the example that we point to. I'm actually going to talk about kitchen surfing, which is also based in New York. They're a platform that enables chefs and home cooks to create their dream menu. And this is actually kind of important, at least from the restaurant perspective, because if you've ever worked in a restaurant, then you know that you're pretty constrained in terms of creativity to the menu that's being served. And really the only way to have some creative control is to become the head chef, which there are only so many head chef roles out there, or even sous chef roles out there. And that actually doesn't necessarily pay well. It's just that you have the prestige and you have the creative control. So in this case, if you are on kitchen surfing, you can put together your dream menu, a customer can bid on that menu, and what happens is you actually go into their homes and you prepare that meal for them and however many guests they noted in their bid. So this does enable people to pursue things that are meaningful to them, but really only some people. So just keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that later. Oh, just kidding. So in the last few years, I've been around a lot of different stakeholders, especially city workforce development employees, and a few different innovation departments. I've been around labor advocates and foundations. And one thing that I've seen that's pretty common across all of these groups is that they're too slammed to answer the questions that they have about this area, especially with city departments, right? They know there's an opportunity, and they also know that there's some dark side. They have questions, but they also have a lot of stuff on their plate. Cities especially can't fail because they provide a service, or many services actually, that the market will not provide. So the thing is that I really believe that researchers have an advantage here, because we, as researchers, actually have a luxury that none of these other groups have, which is the luxury of time to do the research. And of course, you have to find the funding for that. But it is a luxury that a lot of other groups don't have. And actually, this is why people go back to grad school, too. But what they can provide is actually grounded research that then informs design interventions. So for me, as someone who has a work history in both research and implementation, that's what I believe, is that applicable research is going to be the most important thing. So I'm going to share a few of the areas that I've come across that need a lot more research. Okay. So the active-passive income idea is basically a question of opportunity cost. So for example, if you drive a car, then you're selling your physical labor, right? Like your labor is one-to-one for pay. So if you look at Lyft, that's active income generation. Uber is active. TaskRabbit is active. You actually have to be physically present, spending your time in order to make that income. Passive income generation is a little bit different from that. It just means that you do a certain amount of work and it continues to pay dividends. So it's an investment, right? So you have the example with Margot and Skillshare. She puts in the upfront work, she does a little bit of upkeep, and that course continues to pay. You have groups like GetAround, which is sort of similar to Zipcar, except that instead of the company owning the fleet, it's actually people, individuals who are renting out their own cars to other people who need them. There are a few that fall in between. Airbnb is an example where you do a lot of upfront work, you do upkeep, but basically the big thing is that passive income generation is about investment, and that leads to not losing as much time. And active income generation, you do lose time, you have a time cost, but it actually can be more lucrative. So the real-world application of this is actually in workforce development training. So workforce development training has usually fallen along one of two routes. You either have a sector-based approach or a place-based approach. So sector-based approach is when, let's say, a local government has partnered with some industry that's already in that city, and they say, okay, we're going to train people so that they can do the tasks that are needed in your plant, in your factory, for your business, whatever it is, and that gets people to get that job relatively immediately, right? The problem with this is then you have situations like Detroit, where what if that automaker moves, right? I mean, I think it's really funny that Cadillac, which is, I believe is named for the founder of the city of Detroit, but there's also a Cadillac, Michigan, is actually now headquartered in New York. So kind of consider that it's actually relatively up to companies. It's not that difficult nowadays for companies to move. The other aspect is a place-based approach. And a place-based approach is saying, okay, well, this person is going to work in this community. What skills do we need to teach them to get by in this particular community? And this can be a real problem, too, because let's say, for example, you're an immigrant who doesn't speak English. So your place-based training is going to have a lot to do with English training. But that doesn't mean, even if you get job placement, that that's necessarily a high-quality job. It just means that you got a job. So if you were going to do workforce development training around things like the peer economy, what you would actually be teaching is more or less financial literacy. It's business skills. It's how do you market yourself. It's how do you tell the difference between revenue and income. And these are things that actually apply across several industries, but that's something that would need to be known in order to create that sort of workforce development training. So there's also, so if you look at Zipcar, it's considered as part of the sharing economy somehow, but it's not really a peer-to-peer marketplace, right? It's collaborative consumption. People are sharing a pool of resources that is being rented out over and over again. So what they have to do is they actually have to figure out where they're going to place their cars around a city, right? Like it has to make enough money, it has to have enough return for them so that it's actually worth the price. And so it's really based on frequency of usage. But then you have a group like Getaround that provides a comparable service, and in that case, they have no fleet. Their fleet is entirely owned by other people, right? They don't hold onto the asset, which means that the car is wherever their users are, right? Like if you're an owner on Getaround, you put your car on Getaround, then it's going to be in that neighborhood in particular. So the other thing about this too is if you have a car, you also almost have no reason not to put it on Getaround because it's already a sunk cost. You probably don't use it all that often. They actually have like a lot of figures for this. Like at most you use your car 30% of the time, and that's if you're really aggressive with using your car, especially if you're based in a city. So really putting it on Getaround in this case doesn't really hurt. And in poorer neighbors, especially, you could argue that a car is extremely important because potentially it's a food desert where you live, or potentially public transportation doesn't really come often enough, right? So this is a situation in which you possibly have a service actually coming into what are traditionally commercially redlined neighborhoods and offering an option that wasn't there for other people before. On the other side of that is that your geography doesn't preclude you from earning income. So if you look at Lyft and Uber, for example, drivers can actually move around a city, right? Unlike Airbnb, they're not actually stigmatized by the neighborhood that they live in. Let me see. So the real world application is basically, oh no. There we go. So the real world application of this situation is basically that it's not really enough to talk about potential, because that's actually kind of a cop-out to say that these things are possible, because saying them doesn't actually make them happen. So something has to be done to make it happen. And then going back to the donut hole dilemma. So this is the question of who exactly can benefit from the pure economy. So I'm going to give you an example here. There are people who are on social welfare who benefit from a couple of different programs at the same time. You might be on food stamps, you might be on Head Start, you might have affordable housing. I actually used to be on food stamps, and so it's one of those things where you actually have to meet you have to be below a certain income ceiling, and some of these groups have different levels, right? So if you're participating on one of these platforms, then one of the biggest questions becomes whether the amount you're earning is going to put you just over the income cap so that you would get kicked off, but whether the earnings are actually enough to offset all of the benefits that you're about to lose. And being successful on these platforms isn't really an immediate thing, right? That's like the narrative that we hear all the time. But it's not. It's really a lot of work. Some of it does relate to businesses, right? Like you have to know how to market. You have to know things like seasonal rhythms and so on. So the real world application of this is that social welfare is usually distributed on the federal level, but it's administered on the local level. So now that cities might know this, then the question is really whether on a local level there's a way to increase the runway for people who are choosing to have a patchwork income, right? Like that's actually potentially there's some flexibility on the city's part. So one thing that I've seen, and I think probably Arun has seen this too, is that peer-to-peer marketplaces can incentivize people to make higher quality purchases than they otherwise would. So I've seen this happen with people who have bought a car that they really wanted but hadn't thought about maybe making that high of a purchase before. I've seen people do it with homes because they can justify it in that they're renting it out on Airbnb. So this is actually especially important in a city like San Francisco, which is where I live now, or New York, where you have really, really high costs to buy a house, right? So a lot of people actually can't even dream about owning their own homes. You have a built-in revenue, though, in this case, where you're going to earn just enough money to make the high-quality purchases that you want, but not so much security around it that you're going to make really excessive purchases. But the big problem here when it comes to disadvantaged communities is actually what if you don't really have a credit history? Or what if you have bad credit history, right? If you're coming from another country, potentially, like, credit isn't a thing. Like, it's just, the credit is a pretty, I think, American, like, maybe European concept. So you don't necessarily have the credit to be able to go and buy a car or go and buy a home. And for a lot of people, this is actually affecting a lot of normal people. I mean, a lot of people had their homes foreclosed on them in 2008. So one example I'm going to give is that Getaround for the last few years, at the end of each year, will partner with a car dealership where they say to the car dealership, we will get our users to buy your car if you give 0% down payment. And what they offer to the car owners is they say, you can have 0% down payment with a low monthly payment if you rent out your car and get around at least 75% of the time. So this is potentially really awesome, right? Like you have a revenue model built right in. The pay is actually, the amount that's going to cost you is actually relatively very little. You're eventually going to be able to pay off your car. But again, if you don't have the credit history, or if you have bad credit, then you're considered really high risk, right? So instead of $100 a month that you would pay, you're actually going to get charged like $400. So what you're seeing here is there's actually a penalty, right, for basically being low income or basically having bad credit. For the people who really need the income, they're being penalized for actually trying to participate. So the other thing is coming back to the misclassified aspect, where people are always arguing that independent contractors are misclassified and they should actually be employees, because being an employee means that you have certain protection. It means that you can't be fired from your job if you have to take a medical emergency leave. It means that your Social Security and payroll tax are taken care of. Your workers' compensation is there if you get hurt on the job. There's OSHA protecting you in your work environment. There are fair labor standards, so there's anti-discrimination protecting you. And the thing is, if you look at that on the other side, which is what's in it for independent contractors, all they really have is that they're supposedly able to do the work the way that they want to, right? That comes back to the common law of agency. But they don't really have any of these other types of protections. And to me, that really isn't a strategy that we can go on with forever. It's just trying over and over and over again to argue that everybody is misclassified. At some point, we need to have some other tactic, and I think one of those tactics needs to be figuring out how to build some legal leverage into the definition of an independent contractor. Okay. So, my hope today is that I've demonstrated how research can have real-world applications. There are a lot of groups out there that really want to have some hand in making this a truly livable situation for people who just need to work or people who just need that income. And you have a real opportunity to actually provide grounded research so that there are grounded decisions rather than really speculative decisions. So I think the real goal and a lot of the stuff that we talk about when it comes to the pure economy and the fear that we have around it is how doomsday it can become. And I think the key here is actually really to get out in front of the peer-to-peer marketplaces before they get to that point. But you can't do that without design interventions. And design interventions are not good if they're not grounded. Thank you.
This is a meal that was available for pickup Thursday night for people who had signed up with a Berkeley-based startup called Josephine.com. Whole grain burgers, no meat, vegetarian, mustard, tahini, tangy turnip pickles. There's three things I want to say about this. Before starting at a different point. First, it's kind of an obvious symbolic representation of the privilege of an enclave community like Berkeley. Second, it's the merger of, I think, the two great contributions to at least US culture, possibly global culture, that Northern California has to offer, which is the tech economy and food culture. And third, I hope by the end of my story, it's also a sign of hope, of a way that we can infuse our new technological infrastructure with humane and human values. And that's what I want to do here today is tell a story. I'm not an academic, I'm a reporter, and for most of the last 10 years, my intellectual output has been largely in the form of blogging, where I've been forced to come up with opinions on things that happened half an hour ago and publish them an hour later. And I've actually, one of the reasons this conference has been so interesting, there's at least a dozen people here who I've interviewed, or whose books I've reviewed, or whose research, like Tom's, I've depended on. I try to build narratives around that research. And it's a deeply personal narrative that goes back 20 years. When I was a freelance writer in the Bay Area, I wrote a cover story for the San Francisco Bay Guardian called How to Connect to the Internet. I'm sorry. Today, people would want me to write the story of how to disconnect from the Internet. That year, 1994, I devoted myself entirely to writing about the Internet. I think I'm one of the first journalists who earned his mortgage payment and rent from writing for online publications. I was an evangelist. I was a proselytizer. I said, this is going to change everything. We all have to get on board, and you know, it's going to be great. I love technology. I was skeptical of capital, but I love technology, which has led me into many contradictions and paradoxes. As a reporter on the internet in the 90s, I became most intellectually interested in the open source and free software movements and the idea of the internet as a gift economy where people were building this infrastructure through voluntary contributions to each other. This seemed very exciting. It appealed both to libertarian and socialist ideologies. It was collective. It wasn't orchestrated by government. And we could all use it to do amazing things. I've heard a lot of skepticism and fear about technology at this conference, and a lot of, I wish we could return to earlier modes of, stronger labor relations, stronger unions, bigger social welfare, but I don't think any of us really wants to go back to pre-smartphone, pre-internet days. We appreciate what these voluntary contributions built. I dove so deep into it that I ended up trying to write a book online about the free software movement that would incorporate the critiques and contributions of the people who were working in it on the model of free software projects. And I think the peak moment of dot-com insanity came when, not long after Salon, my employer, had an IPO, the Linux operating system provider Red Hat announced that it was going to sponsor my project, and our stock jumped 14%. So as a publisher, my Salon not making any money, Red Hat, a company, wasn't making any money. I was being paid quite well to write about people who were giving away their labor for free. It was obviously unsustainable. It crashed. The book never got finished. The advertising revenue from Red Hat never came. Lots of people were laid off. That was the crash. And a first cycle of skepticism about how technology and capital were intersecting. The next 10 years are one in which we have a narrative that everyone here is familiar with, which is how the new possibilities of the internet constricted what creative professionals could do. As a journalist, I found I was forced to write more and more often, more and more sensationalist headlines for less and less pay. Musicians, artists, everyone has faced this kind of creative dilemma for the same reasons that made things like the free software movement possible. Information easy to share. I mean, the free software movement was the first version of the sharing economy. Then the sharing economy, in the sense of data being easily to share, started constricting the possibilities of labor. Fast forward to about 5 years ago, when Sunset Magazine asked me to write a feature about the, quote, sharing economy. I looked at it and started to get very excited. And a lot of people in my hometown of Berkeley were very excited about it. Here was something that seemed to connect to those original values. It was a way to share, local neighborhoods would share the fruit from their trees. People were sharing their couches versus Airbnb. That seemed really neat. It was a way to deal with the after impacts of the recession. It fit with, especially in Berkeley, this kind of leftover from the 60s collective ideology that we can all get together and do these things we're going to leverage with technology. I interviewed a young lawyer, Janelle Orsi, who built the Sustainable Economies Legal Center, and we got really excited about all the positive social prospects for the sharing economy. And then as a reporter, we watched what Trebor yesterday called the tsunami. Venture capital seeing the possibilities of this model and pouring an astonishing amount of money into it and leveraging these things way up beyond what the small localized groups that I was talking to in Berkeley and in Palo Alto and elsewhere. And it became clear that the sharing economy was actually something else. We keep calling it here. It's also the subcontracting economy. I mean, these were contractual economic relationships between people. People weren't really sharing their couches. They were renting their couches. They weren't really sharing their cars. They were renting their cars. And when you have these contractual relationships and the biggest venture capital companies in the Valley pouring money into it, you start to look at this and go, well what's the story here? How is this making sense? Where's the money coming from? This is great for customers, and the VCs see an exit strategy. So where's this sort of surplus value being generated? Who is paying for this? And you realize it is labor. It is the people who are driving these cars, the people who are renting out their houses are, they're getting by. They're getting some extra income. They're surviving. The big payouts come to a very small group of people at the end of this. And part of what they're seeing is that in the case of, say, Airbnb in San Francisco, well, we can do a hotel industry, but we don't have to pay the hotel tax. In the case of Uber and Lyft, we can basically have a taxi or a rent-a-car industry, but we're not really carrying the same insurance costs as the existing companies. So there were loopholes here that allowed you to provide a service without incurring the same costs as the incumbents, which is an obvious market opportunity. So my second cycle of disillusion set in. The sharing economy was no match for the forces of capital. And I wrote a number of stories about this for Salon, kind of culminating my disgust when I profiled a company called Yerdle, which claimed that they set up a market where everything is free, which is, a refutation of anything we know from economics. I mean, they were actually providing credit to each other. If you don't know what Yerdle is you exchange things that you don't need anymore. What's in your closet? You give it to Yerdle, you get credit for that. You can use that credit for someone else's item on Yerdle. Well, if you want to get something nice on Yerdle, you have to build up a lot of credit, which means you have to give away things that are nice. So it's, it's just another form of money, another form of exchanging value. But this way that these companies were using the rhetoric of progressivism, this is going to be good for the environment, this is going to create community, while exploiting these loopholes. Excuse me. I hope everybody's had lunch because I have more pictures of food to show you. As I said, it induced this new period of skepticism. So this brings us all the way back to the present period, when a friend of mine named Terry Betts told me that she had hooked up with two young guys who had a startup, and she was doing home cooking for this startup. And I was like, not on my watch. Don't you know? Have you been following what I've been writing for 4 years? They're going to exploit your labor. As I said, this is a very personal story. This is someone I've known for 15 years. We met when our kids were in preschool. We tried to run a preschool co-op together. It failed miserably, a real lesson in Berkeley ideology. She has worked in catering. She has worked in the organic food industry. She has worked in restaurants. She's tried to run her own bakery that worked in combination with farmers markets. And when the business cycle goes down and all those things dry up, she works as a waitress. She is a classic member of the Precariat. And the business model for Josephine was you cook in your own home, and people sign up to pick up meals from you. So you're not serving a whole dinner, which turns out to be a rather more involved and exhausting operation. You cook, they come, they're out. So I went to see it. There were about 30 people who came. The portions, well, 30, 35. Portions are $10 each. She made, at that time, coconut chicken curry and garbanzo beans. Next week, she'll be making lamb and beef meatballs with barberries, yogurt, and herb. She told me on a given night she can clear $300 after expenses, considerably better than her waitressing. So how can I argue to her, you know, your labor is being potentially exploited here when this is obviously economically advantageous to her? And I want to tell her, well, what happens if everybody in Berkeley signs up for Josephine, and to get customers, you have to start lowering prices? You know, what happens to your, you know, ideology about expensive organic ingredients when that kind of competition comes in? And I wanted to bring this up. I wanted to find out more about the site. As I am talking to her about this, I'm watching my own social networks. Josephine.com is spreading through them. Another close friend of mine runs a edible garden program at a local public school, middle school. She hooks up with Josephine.com so that people can sign up to get meals that the kids are making as part of this project to raise money for the project. Another friend of mine, Facebook friend of mine, his daughter goes to that school. She makes one of these meals. I think this is, you know, for years I've been covering this as a reporter where there's some distance between me and my subjects. And now I'm watching my kind of life story come to me through Facebook. How does this story end? Where is this going? I went to meet the founders during another night of this thing, two 24-year-old guys, not native to Berkeley, one from New York, one from Los Angeles. They're funded by another like 26-year-old guy who'd sold his company to Facebook. They kind of ended up in the East Bay because, like everybody else right now, they couldn't afford to live in San Francisco. And they accidentally seeded their initial startup with people like Terry and my other friends. Longtime Berkeley, organic, local foodies who are very, you know, as lefty as you would expect your typical 30-year Berkeley resident to be. And in my conversations and observations of how my friends were interacting with the founders of this company, I realized that these two young guys were being radicalized by the cooks. Like, they hadn't come into thinking, well, we're going to stress organic, we're going to stress locally sourced, we're going to stress, you know, farmers markets and kids at public schools. But these were the values of the people who were providing the food, who are pretty experienced in negotiating, you know, merging the political and the personal. And they were soaking it up. They were getting really excited. This was kind of this was going to be their market niche. We're going to do, like, we're going to really build community, and we're going to connect these kinds of foods together. You know, we're going to have the vegetarian chili and cornbread. We're going to, well, this is the Growing Leaders, the middle school project. I was seeing an intersection between the technological infrastructure created by the Silicon Valley model of business and the kind of deep values of the community that I've been in the last 25 years. And it occurred to me that there's a model here worth exploring. If we look at the way kind of Northern California's foodie values have spread over the last 30 years from the point where there was something called California cuisine to now when we don't even talk about that because it's everywhere, you know, seasonal, fresh, organic. Food is slow, it's local. There's no obvious exit moment where you're going to cash in on it. It takes decades to move from Berkeley and San Francisco and Sonoma to northern Florida or, you know, St. Louis. And it's kind of expensive. The Silicon Valley model is fast, it's global, it makes it, you know, a consumer proposition to customers that it's going to be cheap, and there's an exit model. And it's overwhelmed everything. That's why we're here, that's why we're talking about this. We need to look at how this food movement has spread and think about how we can apply that to taking the tools that right now are being created by Silicon Valley Capital and infusing them with the same kind of slow growth. How do you know, we should not give up on the idea that, you know, we can have local co-ops that use the same kind of app technology to connect people in the local community. We need to remember that social movements are slow and technology is very, very fast. And it may take us years to catch up to the transition moment that we're in. And that's why I see this original, you know, tahini burger as hopeful, because a lot of the time, one of the great problems we have in Silicon Valley is we have this very undiverse set of companies that historically were located south of San Francisco that didn't really interact with the very, very diverse communities that were north of that area. Now those communities are colliding. I mean, the major center of that collision is San Francisco, and it's a very tense moment where people are wondering, you know, are our values going to be overwhelmed by the, you know, the techie invasion? But I think at the same time that invasion's happening, people are running into the existing cultural values and being influenced by them. And what I see when I look at Josephine.com is an example of how you can communicate those values. You know, there's plenty of questions to ask about Josephine.com. Can this scale in any way? They're vetting their cooks. There are these kind of, you know, does somebody want a tahini burger in, I don't know what's a good example, but yeah, this is, I don't particularly want one. I want meat. There's places where this is not going to be a local value. How do you, what happens when the first guest gets sick and sues for food poisoning? What do the health inspectors say? You know, what are the food safety rules on something like this? I will make no prediction as to whether this startup could be successful. But I think this human-to-human contact, where we say these are the, you know, these are our values over that we, you know, my children grown up in Berkeley, and they just take these kind of foodie, you know, we're going to eat what's fresh, we're going to eat what's organic, our meat's going to be grass-fed, we're going to eat what's fresh, you know, what's seasonal. That's just what they grew up with. We can spread this. Conferences like this help spread the application of human values to these technological systems. That's my story.
Okay, hi, my name is Arun Sundararajan. I'm a professor at New York University. I sort of suppressed the slide with the title of the talk because it seems sort of excessively ambitious, and I just sort of sent it to Trebor in sort of a moment of like, you know, give me a title. Just to give you some background on who I am, I've been at NYU for about 15 years. I'm with the business school, also with the Center for Urban Science and Progress. My research is about how digital technologies change things. Over the last 3 or so years, I have been seeing the latest iteration of this change manifest itself in what people call the sharing economy. You've been given some background on the sharing economy, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it seems And I tend to sort of focus on things where I don't have a direct sort of financial or career stake in sort of the outcomes. So I'm not going to talk about the disruption of education, but I don't have any commercial ties to any of these other sort of sectors or any other companies in the space for that matter. Perhaps something that my grandkids will not forgive me for at some point, but such as. Now, what I'm trying to illustrate with this slide is that this is a conference about digital labor. And we tend to focus on, we hear a lot about Airbnb, we hear a lot about Uber, we hear a lot about TaskRabbit, and I'll get to all of these companies in a bit. But, to me, it's this is a pretty broad sort of reallocation of capital and labor. Okay, capital being both physical assets and financial capital. And to me, it's hard to sort of have a discussion about the implications of labor on labor without looking at sort of the broader picture of what's happening to the capital, financial, and sort of physical. And what seems to be happening is that we're inventing a whole bunch of models that are creating peer-to-peer ways of, providing stuff, whether it be accommodation on Airbnb, high-end accommodation on One Fine Stay, a couch on, couch surfing, a traditional Korean home on Kozaza. Buying has become different from going and sort of picking up something mainstream. You've got Etsy with handmade stuff. You've got Yodel that Andrew mentioned that I actually like because, they're not sort of, they're different from a lot of the other platforms in that they started as a California benefit corporation. And, there seems to be sort of some logic to their rhetoric of, wanting to sort of lower the ecological footprint through the exchanging of stuff. But you can go there and get stuff. You can get stuff on Quirky that is designed by someone else. Again, they're sort of peer-to-peer design. There's a whole bunch of ways in which you can get food rather than a restaurant. You can eat at Eat With. You can also eat at Feastly, which I did a couple of weeks ago. The group of people also connected to the sharing economy. I don't have their logo up there, so I just thought I'd show you sort of how wonderful their space looks. So you can hire a chef through kitchen surfing. There's a whole bunch of labor markets now that allow you to sort of hire plumbers, electricians, computer technicians. I'll get to these in a bit, but they include TaskRabbit, HomeJoy, Handy, and so on and so forth. I mean, we're rethinking urban transportation. In Europe, you've got BlaBlaCar, which Tom mentioned, and carpooling, which allow people to get into a stranger's car and get driven to another place. You add up the number of people BlaBlaCar and carpooling are carrying together, and it's more than the number of people that Amtrak is carrying today. And so they have sort of created the equivalent of a national rail network using digital technology and existing roads and existing cars. And there's a whole bunch of sort of financial capital allocation that's peer-to-peer. Kickstarter and Indiegogo are more philanthropic. AngelList and Circle Up are more, sort of VC-like. So, and yes, there's a ton of VC money going in here. I mean, according to figures I saw last night, almost $7 billion in all. Here are some of sort of the big allocations, and this changes the nature of things, sure. But to me, this sort of is, it's sort of expanding. The advantage of speaking last is that you can actually sort of change your slides to react to sort of things that the people before you talk about. And so I sort of guessed that Andrew would talk about loopholes. And so in the slides that I carefully prepared last night, I said this is well beyond the loophole economy. Well, to me, it's that there is something sort of different going on here in us inventing ways to get people to sort of transact directly with other people, mediated by these massive, often venture-backed platforms that are creating something to me that is sort of different from the traditional corporation, perhaps not in its ownership, but in its facilitating peer-to-peer interaction, mediated by some other entity. So there's something else that is sitting in between you and the guy who wants to sell you something on Craigslist, or you or the person who wants to sort of lend you their apartment in Europe, or you, the person who's sort of driving a car, whether it's sort of within the city. And so, it of course raises the question of do we have to rethink sort of the regulatory structure? It also raises the question of does this sort of lower or raise wages? Does it sort of create opportunity, or does it sort of lead to this race to the bottom? Does it speed up the economy by, facilitating variety and quality? Does it slow down the economy by sort of causing people to stop buying stuff? So to me, all of these are sort of research questions that I'm trying to answer. I've got some answers which I'll share with you that are preliminary. One set I'll actually release next week, so this is sort of just sort of a teaser. But before I get there, I wanted to sort of say a few things about why this is happening now. To me, the reason why we're seeing sort of this massive scaling of peer-to-peer, which sort of like, the gradual scaling of peer-to-peer that was then sort of made massive by the infusion of financial capital, this sort of follows a path that is familiar to many of us of like, how technological revolutions take place, the bubble, we're in the bubble phase now. But it was sort of induced to me, it was catalyzed perhaps by the recession, but to me it was really induced by the consumerization of digital technology, where consumers became sort of the focus of business, the business of technology about a decade ago, little over a decade ago. Apple was the leader in this, and they sort of controlled the market because they were the only company that had experience doing this for 20 years. Nobody else did. But big tech companies stopped building things for business and then adapting them for consumers and started building things for consumers. And so now we carry around these powerful networked GPS-enabled computers in our pockets. And as a consequence, we're able to sort of like invent new ways of getting the things that we had to go to a company for or had to go to a store for. Okay, so that's part of it. But the other part of the story is, of course, there's sort of environmental concerns, and there is sort of a fair amount of research that millennials who, according to an article that I read yesterday, don't want to be called millennials, don't want to own stuff. They prefer to sort of access it when they need it. And that they also, are more concerned about the environment than generation before them, and so prefer something where, like, you have a lower ecological footprint. So that's there. But to me, sort of like, a third component of it is really this digital trust infrastructure that has been built. And a part of it is something that Tom talked about in great detail. It's the online feedback and reputation systems that, for all practical purposes, on a population scale, sort of eBay invented, right? eBay invented, and eBay, the marketplace itself, did $76 billion in revenue last year, which is a big number, right? And it is sort of being powered by one of these reputation systems. The thing is that this is a, it's one thing to say, I'm going to trust someone enough to sort of receive a package from them. What's the worst that can happen? Well, sort of apart from sort of some really extreme tail events, the worst that can happen is that, like, you don't get the package, the thing is broken, the product isn't as advertised. It's a very different story to say, like, I'm going to get into this stranger's car and be driven to another city, right? Or I'm going to sort of accommodate this person in my spare bedroom, or I'm going to hand over my apartment to this person, or I'm going to hand over my $30,000 car to this person. These are sort of much more requiring of trust. And so when people talk about the digital, I'm not going to mention that, except to sort of thank Tom for not sort of beating up on me as one of the people who sort of like, a couple of years ago talked about the power of reputation systems and sort of like, facilitating this kind of thing. But in 2005, 2006, I was one of like, probably like 100 different people who were studying reputation systems. I was particularly interested in the information contained in the text rather than the numbers. And, a whole bunch of people after me have established sort of like, one of the things that we saw sort of early evidence of on Amazon's marketplaces and on eBay's marketplaces, that what people say in the text matters at least as much as like, what those numbers are saying. People are reading that stuff, that affects pricing power, that affects choice. That literature, not my research, but has also sort of established that the design of these things, whether it's bilateral or unilateral, whether it's like you rating the seller or whether it's both ways, and especially whether you can see the other person's rating before you post yours, these things also matter. And we've also sort of seen that there is a systematic oversampling of the tails, and like, Tom points to that sort of very sort of effectively in this sort of latest iteration of things. But it's something that sort of like, needs to be adjusted for. But to me, the online trust sort of infrastructure is more than that. right? I mean, we've had for a long time platforms certifying particular sellers as being better than others, and this started with eBay's Power Seller. And a lot of platforms, and this is carpooling.com, which is BlaBlaCar's biggest competitor, they have something called Top Driver. A lot of these platforms will sort of signal to their consumers that this person is better than the rest. And that's an important part of the trust infrastructure as well. A lot of these platforms are building conduits to real-world institutions. So Airbnb will let you sort of hold up your license in front of your webcam and will verify that you are who you say you are. So this is not a digital trust infrastructure that is created purely digitally, but it becomes part of the digital trust infrastructure because we're bringing online the real world. And finally, Facebook and LinkedIn, which to me are real-world social capital. These are real-world relationships that have now been digitized and brought online and are playing an increasing sort of role in not just sort of what we buy, but how we can get employed. For example, I mean, other systems like Stack Overflow, actually, there's a lot of evidence that your sort of like career as a software engineer is influenced sort of significantly by your reputation on Stack Overflow, which is probably an early sort of indicator of what's going to happen in other labor markets. But sticking to sort of like, the trust between peers for a moment, all of these components are important components of this trust infrastructure. There are more things, like there's a platform called Trati that is trying to include things like, have you donated blood? Like, sort of, are you a member of an auto club? Are you a member of, these other sort of digitized things that may cause people to, are you who you say you are? Are you a person with good intentions? And these two things are at least as important, if not more important, than can you do the job that you're advertising? Because, when you get into a stranger's car, you're more concerned about whether they're a serial killer and less concerned about their driving skills. And so these kinds of things are sort of digitized systems now that are going beyond sort of like, online feedback. All right, and I've done some sort of analysis on like, Carpooling's platform on like the relative importance of these things. And, not surprisingly, you find that conduits to real-world institutions and platforms, and digitized real-world social capital in a number of different situations will matter more than the online feedback or reputation score, as sort of like, getting people to trust other people as revealed by the choices that they make. And what's surprising to me is that platform certification matters way more than anything else at this point. And so that's sort of interesting. It's probably got implications for the power that these platforms have, but I'm not going to get further into that because, I do want to spend at least 10 minutes on the labor stuff, but I'm going to follow my sort of prior panelists on talking about other stuff as well, in addition to sort of the labor stuff. So what are my hypotheses on the economic impacts? Well, as I said, there's the possibility that this will be growth-inducing for the following reasons, that this sort of expansion of peer-to-peer. Because if you compare Airbnb to hotels, there's a lot more variety at a much wider range of price points. When you have greater variety at a wider range of price points, typically that increases demand rather than reducing it. It increases consumption, and through this sort of cycle grows the economy. So that's a possibility. We are utilizing our physical capital more efficiently. That way we will increase what economists call productivity. I'm sort of using productivity loosely. I'm not going to define what kind of productivity total. It's just, sort of the efficiency with which you use capital increases. Like, if you can tap into sort of the 94% of the time that your car is parked on the street, or the 10% of the time that your apartment is vacant, or the 100% of the time that your spare bedroom is vacant. Fundamentally, you're increasing productivity, and everything else being equal, that should grow the economy. On the other hand, like, if everybody starts to rent cars rather than buy them, we may see people buy less cars. These cars will be used more intensively and therefore will sort of depreciate more rapidly. And so all may not be positive, and so this to me is an open question. Okay, so I have a model of peer-to-peer rental markets that I've been developing with a colleague, Sam Freiberger, who's a fabulous sort of scientist who works with me. For about a year. It's one of those sort of hairy economic models with a lot of math in it, and we've sort of our first stab at calibrate, but it sort of says, like, here's an economy with everything, and like, now let's inject this sort of peer-to-peer rental market into it. What happens? Well, what happens is sort of like, it's hard to measure what has happened, because like, these things are still a relatively small fraction of the economy. So peer-to-peer car rental as compared to sort of automotive sales in the US, it's still a little sort of blip in the economic numbers. So what you do in a situation like that is you say, well, let's sort of simulate what will happen, but let's not just sort of make up numbers. Let's sort of fit the model to numbers that are from data, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from the National Automobile Dealers Association for depreciation, for the National Household Transportation Survey for car usage. And we partnered with GetAround to get sort of like 2 years of data on sort of activity levels within a peer-to-peer rental market to try and understand the behaviors from there. And what do we find? Well, we find that under a wide variety of assumptions, and these are preliminary, and so please don't quote me on them until sort of next week. But since you're here and listening to me, I thought that I'd tell you. But you have the following sort of effects. You have an increase in welfare, which means that like, the slowdown in the sales of cars is more than countered by the increased activity from availability of rentals. The value increases to consumers seem to come from at least 3 sources. One is there's a bunch of people who couldn't afford to own who are now renting. There are people who are renting better things than they used to own. Instead of buying less inferior cars, they are renting superior cars when they need them. And the most interesting to me is that people are sort of buying better cars in order to be, and because they can afford better items, now that they can make some money off of them on the side through a peer-to-peer rental market. Okay, so that's sort of the, and like, this is a map of sort of the footprint of rental activity, and where darker is sort of more rental activity. And this is a map of the income per capita in San Francisco, where darker is higher income per capita. And I see it very clearly. I don't know if you do, but there's an inverse correlation between GetAround rental activity and income per capita, which is not my proof of what I'm asserting, but seems to sort of support the basic idea that this is disproportionately benefiting people on the lower end of the income spectrum. What it's also doing is blurring the line between personal and professional. What do I mean by that? Well, we've had well-defined sort of norms around, I pick up someone from the airport when they come to town. I can, without any sort of special permission from the government, I can take my friends' kids to sort of like, their piano recital. I can cook my friends a meal and have them over. I can lend my apartment to a friend. I can have friends stay over in my apartment. I mean, all of these were sort of under the umbrella of personal. And then you had people who were restaurateurs, who were sort of bed and breakfast owners, who were taxi drivers. And now we're sort of blurring these lines between personal and professional. We've sort of created this continuum of commercial activity. And to me, that is sort of like, at the heart of what is happening because of this sort of peer-to-peer economy to like, the nature of work. We are creating a whole bunch of activities that used to be personal and fine, that are now sort of like, being, that we're sort of offering up for money. And this raises a whole host of issues. I mean, like, some of the regulatory issues that have come up are sort of the little ones to me. Is it legal? Are you sort of a hotel? Are you paying hotel taxes? Like, do you have a medallion for a taxi? But there are sort of much bigger sort of labor protection issues that are going to come up sort of like, over the coming years. There are issues of discrimination that are going to come up. We've set up like a protection infrastructure to sort of prevent sort of like, discrimination with the assumption of a corporate sort of consumer model of interaction. And now we have like, sort of this peer-to-peer, and people are saying, well, it's my apartment. Like, I can accommodate whoever I want. I mean, it's my space. And, the law has sort of like, some incompletenesses there that I feel like, government should be paying much closer attention to rather than like, sort of the hotel taxes and stuff. And, this is sort of consistent with a trend that we've been seeing for a long time of the workforce going freelance. To me, some of the positives have to do with the fact that you now have these finishing schools for entrepreneurs, these gateways for innovation. We've lowered the barriers to entrepreneurship. It also means that we're counting employment wrong, and part of my research is trying to understand like just how badly we're miscounting it, but I don't have any answers yet. So I've had a bunch of students looking at hourly wages on a leading sort of peer-to-peer labor marketplace for a couple of months now. And this research is not complete, and so that's why I don't have any numbers up there, and I haven't. But the trend that I'm seeing is very clear. The trend that I'm seeing is that if I compare the Bureau of Labor Statistics average wage rate for a particular region, like for Phoenix, or for New York, or for Chicago, with the posted prices per hour on labor marketplaces like TaskRabbit and Handy, the posted prices on these labor marketplaces are across the board substantially higher than the average BLS numbers. Now, this is a mystery to me because, it seems like it requires some explanation. I'm not sort of putting my name next to these numbers yet, but I'm sure that when I put this study out, it will have this message. The exact numbers may be different. And, because it runs counter to the story that I hear a lot, which is this sort of race to the bottom that is induced by sites like TaskRabbit, which is that they're going to sort of pull the bottom out of the labor market and we're going to see wages fall rather than go up. And we have seen wages fall for a number of professions because of Odesk and Elance and marketplaces like that. And so, I think part of the answer has to do with the fact that, Alan, there's an economist at Princeton who has this index of offshoreability, which has to do with, he had developed it to try and figure out how easy is it to ship a particular profession to another country. And it measures a bunch of things that have to do with how much of this is data entry, how much of it sort of involves the exchange of digital, how much of it involves having to be co-located with sort of something that is at your customer's site. So for example, it's hard to offshore plumbing, right? Until sort of the robots are sort of sophisticated enough, your plumber's gonna have to be in the room when they do their work. And so I think that what seems to be represented more on these marketplaces at this point are the professions that are not easily offshoreable. A yard worker, a painter, a mover, personal care aide, a childcare worker, home cleaner, plumber, pet sitter. I mean, these are things where the person has to physically be there. So you're not going to see this sort of falling out of the bottom of wages of the kind that you might have seen for copy editing, for example. Another thing that I think we should remember is that labor is not limitless, right? I mean, there's always a fear that so what happens if everybody's teenager becomes a child caregiver? These marketplaces will sort of lower the thing is that we only have so much time. We can't be flooding every single labor market with sort of an excess of supply, right? There's only sort of so many of us to go around. And so for the stuff that is not offshoreable, I don't sort of expect a sudden flood of labor. There's also the fact that fundamentally, there are efficiencies that are created by labor markets in certain professions. If I don't have a good context for this because when I need a plumber, I call my building. So I'm not like a homeowner who sort of has context for I hired this person to sort of rebuild my bedroom but it seems to me that this tends to happen through word of mouth. And it tends to happen often with very little information about who's better than whom. So you just sort of stick with whoever you have. Now, economists have noticed in markets like this where you don't have good quality screening and you don't have good information, these are sort of often called markets for lemons, where sort of the high end sort of goes out of these markets. They exit the markets. And so what we could be seeing when you sort of create a marketplace like TaskRabbit is that the people who know that they will sort of overperform because they are the best at what they do, may be sort of over-selecting to join these marketplaces in skilled professions. Now, I'm not saying anything about the person who you pay to sort of stand in line at the DMV for you, although it's not clear that TaskRabbit sort of has that option anymore, although there is another marketplace called Job Runners that does. And it could just be that the better people are the people with computers and who are sort of tech savvy, and we'll see sort of these even out over time as sort of more people come into these markets. But I thought this was an important sort of preliminary finding to share with you guys because it does sort of seem to run counter to the idea that these marketplaces are fundamentally not good for labor. Okay, I've got about 5 minutes by my count. Does that sort of seem, yeah? I've got way more than 5 minutes of material, but the thing is that what I expect to happen is that we're going to start to look to these large platforms as being institutions in the same way that we have looked to companies for sort of being institutions that provide some part of the sort of worker protection safety net. Okay, like 50 years ago, if you worked for a big company, you were guaranteed a pension. Now you're not. We've created some sort of solution through the 401k, right, for middle class and upper middle class people. You put in money, the government gives you a tax break, the company sort of sometimes matches. And so, that part of the safety net sort of got stripped away from companies and has sort of, a new solution has emerged. Maybe other new solutions will emerge, but to me, I think, and I argued this a couple of weeks ago in a little article that I wrote, that the logical entity to sort of take on some of this responsibility is the platform that is sitting in between. Not because I want to hold them up to a higher moral standard, but because to me it's smart capitalism. Both Uber and Lyft suffer from retention issues. It would make a lot of sense for them to partner with someone like Peers that has a couple of days ago reinvented themselves as a supplier of worker protection. To partner with someone like that and actually sort of use this as a way of locking drivers into their platform, offer some sort of form of health insurance, offer some sort of workers' compensation. There's a whole bunch of things that sort of the freelance workforce is sort of exposed. And to me, this isn't I think that there's a real danger that we will sort of drift towards an equilibrium where these protections just go away. But to me, a smart platform would actually sort of be embracing them rather than sort of trying to run away from them. If only they were not sort of accused of being a hotel. If they sort of then gave their hosts some sort of protections. And so that seems to be sort of one fallout of this sort of, are you a hotel or are you not? All right, to me, this is also sort of part of a broader trend that I've been observing for the last decade of platforms starting to do what we used to ask the governments to do. We've sort of handed over the mediation of copyright to iTunes and Amazon as we've bought more and more digital music and video. It doesn't really matter what copyright law says anymore. The rights that you have and the rights that the creator keeps are sort of mediated by your DRM contract and not by copyright law anymore when you buy digital music. I have an expired driver's license that hasn't been renewed for more than a year. I don't drive I live in Manhattan, and so I don't need to drive, and I've got another card that I use when I fly. And so that form of ID is sort of largely irrelevant to me, but if my Facebook and LinkedIn accounts were sort of deactivated one day, they are my form of ID in a whole host of things that I use actively, and I'm going to sort of need to create so we've handed over part of identity to to platforms, and so we're giving platforms a lot of responsibility, and I think we need to sort of discuss whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. This is just my way of saying Foucault during a talk as well. So I had that planned in advance. Anyway, so as I mentioned, Peers is a sort of used to be a sort of a movement entrepreneur type sort of thing that was sort of fighting for the rights of the peers and is now a for-profit platform that is finding them work and selling them protection. But it's an interesting development. That sort of transition is interesting and it's worth keeping an eye on because it sort of is the first sort of large-scale example of a marketplace for freelance worker protection. The Freelancers Union has been doing this with health insurance, although they sort of divested that business a few months ago after Obamacare. But, this is sort of every other dimension of what you would expect when you work for a company they seem to be going after. So there's that, the social net. There's a debate that is going on about whether these platforms should be organized as cooperatives or as corporations, given that they are sort of hugely dependent on suppliers. I think that it's going to be increasingly hard for the platforms that are VC funded to morph into worker-owned cooperatives. But I also do think for a business like Uber's, the fundamentals, the economic fundamentals of that business, there are sort of roughly equal contributions by individual workers. This is a sort of not very technology dependent, 5 years down the line, that sort of thing for sort of connecting drivers and passengers will be sort of largely commoditized. So no huge R&D investments needed, and the product sort of stays relatively uniform over time. All of these are textbook sort of features of a industry where a cooperative can be more efficient than a shareholder corporation. So I think Uber's biggest threat, frankly, is that, like, you know, if they continue to sort of raise their commissions and, like, you know, have unhappy drivers, that at some point the 10,000 drivers in New York are going to say, listen, like, you know, we're just going to sort of start our own. And then at that point, I'm going to say, well, I use Uber and Lyft a lot, and I'll use them when I travel, but I don't really care that they're in 200 cities. I mean, I'm going to use the service that has the drivers in New York, right? So these markets may be more contestable and less defensible through network effects than we think they are. Airbnb is a whole different story. And then finally, you know, I'm going to sort of end with a couple of sort of unrelated observations. This is sort of just sort of visually depicting something that I said earlier, the volume of rides on one of the two sort of, like, you know, city-to-city carpooling networks. This is in Germany a couple of years ago. But, you know, I sort of see invisible infrastructure when I look at this video. It's sort of, to me, one of the huge opportunities of the sharing economy, especially in sort of, like, you know, countries outside of the United States and Western Europe, which have huge infrastructure needs, to sort of create these invisible layers of infrastructure that leverage existing physical assets rather than having to use new steel and concrete. Like Airbnb accommodated 120,000 people during the World Cup. BlaBlaCar moved, like, you know, thousands of people during that volcanic eruption. And so, you know, there's sort of the disaster sort of response stuff, but there's also everyday stuff. There are lots of towns which can't afford a metro. Maybe they will get something akin to sort of, like, you know, public transportation through a network of people who are ride sharing. You know, there are many towns that can't afford hotels. Maybe they will sort of, like, you know, get something akin to sort of tourist accommodation through something like Airbnb. So I've always been puzzled by why people would, you know, I can see the value proposition in sort of getting into someone's car. It's inexpensive, but I was always puzzled by, like, you know, why would you open up your car to strangers? You know, if you're driving from one city to another. So I asked carpooling, I asked BlaBlaCar, and, you know, carpooling gave me a bunch of reasons. BlaBlaCar would always sort of, you know, the two French guys, and they're sort of like, well, you know, so a bunch of reasons. And then they sort of sent me this sort of growth chart. And I'm like, no, I'm more interested in, like, you know, what is motivating people to sort of offer up seats in their cars? And then I didn't hear from them for a while. And then they sort of sent me this picture. And they're like, look at the picture and you will understand. So to them, this is sort of the reason why. So I was like, yes, I get it. I mean, like, you know, you get two people in your car, you lower your fuel costs. But So the point I'm making here is that we have heard for a long time that digital technologies are isolating, that they create these connections that are not sort of high bandwidth, that are sort of tethers rather than real emotive relationships. And Sherry Turkle is perhaps sort of, like, you know, the single most sort of influential sort of proponent of this view in a series of 3 sort of really well-written and influential books. The most recent of was Alone Together. And, you know, you sort of look at what is said, and, like, what the story that seems to be the story that is being told is one of technological progress leading to a disconnection from community and a fragmentation of connectedness. Now, the thing is that this isn't a quote from Sherry Turkle. This is a quote from Nisbet in 1953, who was sort of saying the same thing. And this is a quote from his book as well, about sort of destroying established social context, except that that's not from his book either. I mean, he's quoting Durkheim from the late 1900s. So again, like, you know, this seems to be a theme that has sort of that has been sitting underneath technological progress and its impact on connectedness and community for over 100 years, for almost 150 years. And its latest manifestation seems to be sort of the creation of this new sort of social relationship, right? I mean, like, you know, the Facebook friendship, which sort of means so many different things to so many people. Like, you know, I have all these people, like, you know, they've made a noun a verb, but they've also created a new class of social relationship, right? I mean, the Facebook friendship. And it's troubling because there's a lot of evidence that has come out of scientists that I am not one of, I mean, who are sort of like, you know, neuroscientists and developmental psychologists and social psychologists, that we need social connection. Like, you know, we need it in a neurological, sort of physiological way. We feel social pain from lack of connectedness to other human beings in the same way that we feel physical pain. And so when I see sort of the sharing economy emerge and I see it sort of reintegrating sort of genuine human contact, however minimal, into everyday activities. So it's not like Meetup where we're saying like go and meet people through the technology. We're saying like, you have some sort of real human connection with that Lyft driver or like, with the Airbnb host. Or like, instead of driving to work alone, you're driving with another person. Or instead of doing your groceries in sort of this isolated way, if you live in France, you can sort of like, go to a marketplace called the Food Assembly. I don't need audio because it's in French and I don't know French and it's got subtitles. But I mean, this is a marketplace where, there are 600 different sites where individuals in the neighborhood connect the local farmers markets using Food Assembly's sort of platform technology to a bunch of consumers. And then they come and clear a few times a week. And so the process of grocery shopping becomes sort of social and sort of community-based rather than sort of individual and isolated, like, me in the deli. And so to me, one of the big, I don't think that people are going to sharing economy platforms for connectedness. I think they go there for price and for convenience and for variety. But a story that I have heard a lot from the people I have talked to is that they stay because of the community, because they sort of like the consumption experience more. And so this is sort of one of the hopes that I have that will be like, one of the positive spillovers of this is that it will reverse a 150-year-long trend of like technology being isolated. Okay, I'm sort of seeding a platform called the Peer Collaborative, sort of ably assisted by the Public Society at Brooklyn. I see two people from the Public Society here, Christian and Shirley. I'm not going to tell you anything more about it except like, sort of look for news at the end of the year. It has to do with research and objective thought and not, it's not anything commercial, but I've taken 6 minutes more than I was supposed to, so thank you for your time.
Okay, when Arun and I talked about putting this together initially, I promised him that this would be a fair shake and we would have a kind of respectful exchange. So I just want to add, before we hand over to all of you, just a few thoughts, I guess like provocations, and really clearly coming from a different position, and sort of add a few thoughts or arguments that haven't really been in that shake so far, right? So earlier on this morning, I was talking about, Jaron Lanier's newest book, Who Owns the Future, who emphasizes that, or who argues that basically the internet will kill the middle class, right? And we see this with some of these technology, I would argue, in a sense that basically makes the harsher and harsher inequality, right? So almost half of all Americans can barely pay for food, healthcare, or housing at one point in their life right now through these kind of marketplaces. We heard about elders opening their houses and transforming, taking people into their houses. And I just wanted to basically contrast that to the vision of this conservative economist Tyler Cowen, whom I mentioned this morning, who basically argued that in 2020, there will be 10 to 15% of people that will make over $1 million a year, and the rest will be scaled down to $5,000 to $15,000 a year. So how are these people supposed to survive? Maybe the sharing economy, right? So I'm trying to provoke here a little bit. We heard just recently a blog post from UberX, which was celebrating high school teachers driving UberX on the side to survive, right? So again, you could of course say that's a good thing. On the other hand, you could also say, isn't that just imperative, or doesn't that show us sort of how screwed up capitalism is, right? That a teacher actually has to drive a taxi. And this is sort of like the argument that I want to add to this, which is basically, sure, people are making extra money. Some of my students are renting out through Airbnb, but like, why are they actually having to do this, right? Like, what is the precarity that leads them to do this? in San Francisco, an Uber driver killed a 6-year-old girl who walked into the street, and which was, he was on his cell phone. She was running into the street. He didn't pay attention. She shouldn't have been there. And all these kind of insurance issues came up. Like, so who is to blame, right? Who is insured? Is the driver at fault, or is Uber at fault, right? So these kinds of things. And then there's a lot of the sort of rhetoric of the Californian ideology that comes up over and over again when going to sharing economy conferences, right, where there are frequently slides of all of these platforms are interspersed with slides from Occupy and the Arab Spring. In other words, sort of like signaling this vast takeover. And also just the pure terminology, and I think, many of us are aware of that, of course. It's like, what I really strikes me as what is a real problem for me. It irks me when I hear peers, right? Because this is by no means, at least in some of the examples, peer-to-peer, right? So like, how is Airbnb peer-to-peer, or how is Uber peer-to-peer, right? I mean, so what happens there is basically that market incumbents are taking over, and now the money basically is not a connection from peer-to-peer, it's basically people interacting in a marketplace, and the profits are now migrated to a 24-year-old, right? So Airbnb having now more rooms, or as many rooms as the Hilton chain, right, basically is a transfer, right, to a new business model, right? So I just wanted to enter that into the discussion as well. I wanted to also point out that there are no contracts, right? So that when an Uber driver gets not fired but deactivated, as they put it, is basically can be done at a second's notice, right? Rates can be changed at a second's notice, as we saw in Chicago, where basically all you have, your relationship with this company is through this iPhone app, and all you have is that. And so basically, if the company decides to change the rate, as they did, you basically suddenly face a completely new contract, and there's no recourse for that, right? At least for now. And then, you brought up this kind of fact that, workers in the on TaskRabbit, for example, are not doing so badly, and I agree. They actually, I also saw that they make quite good money. I would agree with that. But then it also takes an enormous energy and assumes that you are sort of forever young to perform those jobs, right? I mean, if you want to get up every day and then look on your phone where you go in the afternoon, you better be like a 25-year-old with a lot of stamina and vitamins in your body and frequent yoga exercises. Which, you could link that very much to this ideology of, take your vitamins, go work out, and be productive also into your old age, simply to sort of bloody hold up to that economy that's just bloody exhausting, I mean, how are you going to live there? I mean, how are you going to live in that sort of context where you basically have to just constantly run from one little job to the next? Okay, the payment is all right, but who will keep up with that? What if you get sick? I mean, how does this change your life when you let somebody into your house, right? I mean, one way of talking about it is to say that it makes, like the isolated elder more social. Another way is basically it really completely transforms people's life, but who suddenly have to live with strangers, right? What else do we have here? I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I just want to sort of add these few things. I think it's incredibly complex, and there are a lot of positive examples, and also like this market sharing, for example, that you brought up in the end. There are fantastic examples. BlaBlaCar seems fantastic, hardly turns any profit, they told me, but has 1 million rides a week or something, right, or a month. Like an enormous number of people use it. So, but I find this conflation as particularly disturbing, to conflate things like Wikipedia, truly peer-driven initiatives that are really close to my heart, with these kind of businesses that are highly centralized and basically shuffle $15 billion into the hands of a few youngsters. Okay, so how's that for a provocation? All right, so...
Hi, so I'm Dave Carroll. I'm a faculty here at Parsons New School, and become an entrepreneur myself and have asked an accountant what's the difference between an independent contractor and an employee, because I'm struggling this with myself. And an accountant will tell you that the minute you give a piece of equipment and tell somebody to go and be at a certain place, that the IRS says that's the difference. So basically, if I say, use my computer and come to my office and come at this time, that's what the IRS says is the difference between an independent contractor and an employee. So I'm talking very pragmatic terms here.
So which one is it?
So I'm asking for, you know, sort of, if this ultimately comes down to the IRS tax code and the enforcement of it, how does, for example, Uber get away with saying they're independent contractors when it's providing the equipment, which in turn says, be here at a certain time. So by giving the iPhone, it's the equivalent of giving a computer, and then the schedule is determined saying, be here at this time to do this job. That, the IRS could interpret that as that's an employee's job. So that's my question to the panel. How does tax code get interpreted to the...
Well, I can do what I'm good at, which is sort of like, you know, saying that's a really good question and then answering a different one. As a professor, I'm sort of good at that. My sense is that it has to do with, they are not actually asking the... Actually, before I get to that, let's just clarify that, you know, Uber is on the right tail of some of the downsides of capitalism, or the sort of like the venture-backed capitalist model. They're not a good sort of representative example of what happens. They are sort of an extreme example of, you know, there are some things sort of clearly broken in the company in terms of like, you know, the choices that they're making. So you know, it's frustrating to me when I hear Uber stories. I mean, not because I don't think that they're important, but I don't think that they're representative of like, you know, what we should fear as the median outcome when we sort of like, you know, move work from corporations to peer-to-peer platforms, but what we should see as sort of the extreme outcome in a particular platform that seems to sort of think that their drivers will be sort of like, you know, deactivate because like, you know, self-driving cars in a few years. But I think it has to do with the fact that they are not telling the drivers to come to a particular point. The drivers are going wherever they want. And like, you know, so they're not, there is nothing that is being required by Uber of the drivers in terms of like, you know, here is where you need to be at this particular point in time. And while the phone may be equipment that they're renting to them and they may be financing the cars, they don't actually sort of give them the cars, they just sort of finance them. So that is probably where they're drawing the distinction and preserving them as independent contractors.
So I'm going to kind of piggyback off of Arun here. In terms of how to determine a common, or I guess an employee from an independent contractor, there are actually two tests. One is the common law, which is what you're referring to, is do you have the agency to choose when you're going to work, have your own equipment. There's actually 20 factors that determine whether you fall under the common law of agency. And the other is called the economic realities test, which is, are you dependent on that particular group for the majority of your income, right? And so I think it's really interesting because we always tend to bias the common law, and actually if you look at both of them, they may give you different answers on who is an employee. In theory, we're supposed to be looking at a hybrid of that, but that's not how we judge cases in court. In terms of how Uber justifies this, and this is how Uber justifies it, right, is that, and I would say that, you know, I like Lyft a lot better, but I would say that Lyft kind of comes under the same issue, right? Like they might have a different company culture, but their model is relatively similar. But in terms of how Uber justifies it, I was at a city council meeting once where there was an Uber representative, and she described Uber as a lead generation software platform, right? So you're matching up people with their rides. And so they say what they are is a software company, not a car company, right? And I think that's a really interesting way, or very revealing of the sort of rhetoric they're putting out there to try to convey to you. They're basically trying to distance themselves as much as possible from having misclassified people, right? And I actually was sitting next to Travis, who's the founder of Uber once, and I was telling him about the FedEx case, and he's all like, but they lost, right? And I was like, no, in some cases, they actually won. Like, FedEx really did misclassify those employees. But when it comes down to it, I think they're kind of going, again, on what Arun said, which is that you choose when to sign on to the platform. You can choose not to pick up a ride. You choose which city you want to go to be picking up rides, right? So that's their justification for it.
Can I take a quick bit there? Just to say that I think there's one other class action suit that's worth watching in this context, which is a company called Handybook, which is a cleaning, basically, service, that kind of thing. And the people who work for that have just started one a few days ago. So that'll be an interesting one to watch, because I do think it goes beyond Uber in this question. I think the one other thing I'd want to point here, and this is picking up from something Denise said there, really, I mean, the companies will try as long as possible to see if they can have it both ways, right? They want to have their cake and eat it too. And one thing we'll have to watch here is the whole Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, right, which is basically says, company, if you have a blog, you're not responsible for the comments, right? That's the principle. But then again, when it comes down to this kind of thing, all of a sudden it's hands off, and oh no, we're just a matching service. That's all we do. But I think that's increasingly coming into conflict with the kind of requirements they have to put in place, because they also live and die by their brand. So I think it's a key thing, and I don't know how it's going to go, but it'll be worth watching, that's for sure.
Hi, my name is Patricia Gerardo. I'm with Open Society Foundations. I want to thank you all for your presentations. I would love to hear you all speak a little bit more about race within this, which wasn't really covered, right? So if we're talking about an economy that is going to be increasingly about reputation, how do we either push, the Lyft, Airbnbs on implicit bias to document that? To what extent is that considered? Is that part of the algorithm? Oh, we have 80% of white people voting, there's going to be X number of, knocks against African Americans, Mexicans, right? So is that built into the data in any way? You probably all saw the Harvard study, the digital discrimination in Airbnb, which really covered both African Americans as providers, but there's also research that's being done about African Americans being denied spaces as users, as people who are seeking housing and being told, no block supply. So, and Denise, you talked a little bit about credit and your credit rating, but also that doesn't seem to be, a safety net, right? So we had even with, the Justice Department brought suit against Wells Fargo because they were giving African Americans predatory loans, even when they had the data saying that the credit risk was very safe. So there's, something about the numbers also when we have the data that doesn't protect us against discrimination. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I can just add a little bit to that in keeping with the general theme of my presentation, which is whether these, in terms of whether this reflects the communities that they're in. My friend Terry happens to be married to an African American, and she introduced this service to a mutual friend of theirs who works trying to get the generally white farmers markets of northern Berkeley more involved in Oakland, and had integrated that into her offerings on this service, which was part of what made me see that, that the technology, if this is typically, it is mostly in San Francisco, we're seeing less diversity. Here, rooted in a more diverse community, it was reflecting the community because of the people who were involved with it. So while in the larger context, I think we definitely ignore the racial aspects of a lot of the ways that people are adopting these technologies. it's certainly not impossible. It really depends on the people and what they bring to these tools and whether they're actually active in integrating their communities and their values into how they use them.
So I don't know about their algorithms all that much in their data, and mainly because a lot of these companies won't share that information. So what I can tell you are a few things that I've seen. Also that in general, I feel like a comment overall on quantitative stuff is sometimes you have quantitative research that can point you to a direction, but it doesn't tell you why something's happening, or it doesn't tell you the details. And that's where you really have a situation where you need qualitative research a little bit more. So one of the things that I've seen, as you mentioned, with the Harvard study was that in the selection process for a host on Airbnb, you may show discrimination. And in the selection process for a guest, you might also do the same. Other things that I've heard of is that in the ratings, let's say, for example, you may be maybe let's say you're racist and you are taking a car, and then at the end of the ride, what you do is you rate that person poorly. That can be a situation that could come up, right? And it doesn't impact you as the rider, because what would impact you is if you canceled the ride, right, and completely just denied that person, because that actually shows up on your record. But the ability to rate somebody poorly as the consumer, I think is a really big thing, and kind of comes back to what Tom was talking about earlier. And then finally, the other thing is in the pickups, right? So let's say somebody who is driving may or may not be racist, or maybe just ignorant, right? Like there's some amount of privilege or some amount of assumption that happens. So I had a friend who lives in Oakland. Her boyfriend is big and black, and they were in an area that is usually really, really hard to get public transportation, really, really difficult to get a taxi, but they needed to get a taxi. And so they needed to get a car. So he ordered, I don't know whether it was an Uber or a Lyft, but it's one of those TNCs. And a driver came, looked around, and then canceled the ride. And the reasoning that she surmised around this was because that person looked around, the black person was completely invisible to that driver, or otherwise looked around and was like, oh, that can't possibly be the person who called me for a ride. So.
Just a couple of quick additions to that, because I think that this is sort of a hugely important question, because there are two things happening here, right? I mean, one is a shift away from company to individual and towards individual to individual, and the sort of like, the rules may not be as well defined for individual to individual sort of interactions as they are for, like, you can't turn me away based on my ethnicity if you are a hotel, but, if you're an Airbnb host and you see that I'm originally from India, and you're worried that I'm going to sort of cook really sort of spicy food that sort of smells up the apartment, and you sort of say, like, I'm not going to give you a comment. I mean, the lines over there aren't sort of drawn as clearly. And if we do evolve into an economy that is peer-to-peer, we need to sort of like, understand and rectify. And that's one place where this is the kind of thing where you have what an economist would call market failure. Markets don't sort of come up with the right solutions here. So this is a place where I would sort of actively encourage government oversight and intervention. But there are two other things to sort of think about as well. I mean, one is to sort of think about whether this transition and whether the existence of these platforms is making things better or worse. While sort of like, agreeing with the philosophy that any evidence of discrimination is sort of like not a good thing. One of the things that I think that we should look at is, can we utilize these platforms to correct behaviors that we see in the real world? And TaskRabbit, for example, told me a couple of months ago, actually, on a panel, and it's sort of like, online, their president was sort of on a panel with me, and she sort of asserted that they have algorithms that are actively looking for and trying to suppress sort of any sort of ethnicity or race or gender-based discriminatory behavior by, like, their customers for their workforce. And, it was and so that's the kind of thing where, like, you can actually bake better behavior or impose, like, sort of better things into an algorithm That still doesn't account for the other important point that you raised, and I haven't seen this addressed because I've looked closely at that Airbnb study, and I've spoken many times to Michael Luca, who he was actually in my office yesterday, and we were talking about how it's about providers, and we need a lot more research on guests. But the thing is that what people haven't looked at is the inherent bias that may be contained in these reputation systems, and especially given that sort of the distribution of the population that is generating the early reviews may not be the distribution of population as a whole. And this could actually sort of create sort of bias that sustains over time. And this is something that platforms need to look at.
Just to that, I said this in another panel yesterday, the bias in other policies. So TaskRabbit will do credit checks, criminal checks for people seeking employment, which is discriminatory in and of itself, and looking at our criminal justice system. They will not do that for the person who is seeking services in their house, even though it is an equal risk, right? So it's based upon biases that we have that we can be more intrusive into employees' lives than we can in employers' lives. So just that policy by TaskRabbit is discriminatory in and of itself.
There were a few more questions here, right?
Yeah.
Jesus.
Helene Olin, I'm contributing editor at Pacific Standard. I'm going to turn this conversation on its head a tiny bit. One of the things that hasn't come up in these discussions very often is the issue of consumer rights. We keep looking at this, correctly so, but for the most part, as a workers' rights issue. But consumers also have rights. And to use the hotel example for a minute, though I hate to use Airbnb over and over again, the hotel industry develops in part because people used to travel and they would stay at rather sketchy places. And this was a way to make things safer for people. Reputation doesn't always protect people. For instance, if I'm going to rent an Airbnb, I'm probably not going to look for smoke detectors. Similarly, to use Josephine, which by the way sounds amazing, I have 2 teenage boys and I hate cooking, so I'm moving to Berkeley immediately. Nobody's checking her kitchen. And I'm sure your friend is wonderful, by the way, okay? But I can see a situation developing really fast as more people sign up and the pressures on people to bring the costs down or increased, where stuff might slide, so to speak. And how do we address that and still make this a situation that is safe, that is affordable, and works for both the worker and the consumer?
Well, honestly, I looked to see if I had sort of interrupted someone, but to me, actually, the conversation of the last 2 years has, in some sort of indirect way, had this undertone of consumer protection and consumer rights. The Taxi and Limousine Commission will argue that everything that they do in order to sort of screen drivers has to do with consumer protection. And they're right to some extent because in their absence, a decade ago, people wouldn't have felt safe getting into taxis. However, now we have this sort of new entity that's sitting between the driver and you, which can perhaps sort of absorb some of those responsibilities. So to me, there's... I'm
talking about car inspection, though.
Yes.
I'm talking about the reputation of the driver.
Well, see, the thing is that, I think it's a misnomer to sort of characterize everything that a platform can do as being sort of embodied by that feedback system. Like in California, for example, there's legislation, and all of the platforms follow it, that have like a 19-point set of things that Lyft or Uber is responsible for. So they've been sort of delegated a bunch of consumer protection responsibilities that include things like vehicle inspection and driver background checks and sort of zero drug and alcohol tolerance policies. We don't have similar protections yet in the food sharing business. This is sort of less of an issue for someone who is, coming to your home to cook for you through kitchen surfing, because there's never been any protection on someone coming to your home to cook for you. It's more sort of an issue for prepared foods. But again, to me, we've got to think about where we want to draw the line there, because, perfect consumer protection in the food services business, for example, would involve a health inspector stationed in every restaurant, testing every piece of food as it comes out of the kitchen, right? Now, we have said that that's sort of overkill, and we've drawn the line somewhere at random inspections, like, sort of, or Yelp-driven inspections, if you believe most sort of health departments. But, as we sort of say, well, now we're entering an era in which a lot of people will be making food commercially in their personal kitchens, we say, well, I don't think that we should sort of impose the same statute that we had for restaurants, but we should sort of invent a new one based on where we want that line drawn. And the platforms certainly have to play a role. Maybe peers will play a role, like, someone sort of becoming a inspector that, like, sort of like a professional on a platform becoming sort of like a matrix inspector. But it's an important issue, but I don't think that the solution is going to be the same as the solution that existed for a world of taxis without platforms or restaurants or hotels.
Well, so there is actually food laws.
Yeah.
So.
I'll come up. I'll get my set.
Sorry. So there actually are food laws. Not like I don't think we should look at restaurants as the sort of the inspection standard when we're talking about food made at home, because that's actually called cottage industries, and there are laws around that right now. I doubt if any of these platforms actually follow them, but actually among people who have been working in food activism for a while, cottage industry laws are really outdated, and they're very, very poorly constructed to actually protect consumers, right? Like they have things like you must work in a licensed kitchen, a commercial kitchen, but a commercial kitchen could be a kitchen in a church that's rarely used, but it's just certified as a commercial kitchen. It's also incredibly cost prohibitive to access those kitchens in the first place. So not only are you paying a lot of money for potentially a kind of shitty kitchen that's like very dirty and actually potentially less clean than your own kitchen. I mean, it's really been a big problem in terms of smaller entrepreneurs really being able to like dip their feet in. And so I was going to say that is a thing that, in my mind, actually needs to be challenged. And it doesn't really protect right now. I mean, I know consumers are kind of caught in the middle at the moment, but I think that kind of stuff is going to come to a head and is totally necessary even on a public policy level. And then in terms of other consumer rights, the only group I know that really does this kind of well is Etsy, because they help their users understand that they're really setting up a small business. And they don't mince words. And one of the things that their users have to think about is the toxicity of their materials, right? And the industrial integrity, the structural integrity of the stuff that they create. If they're creating furniture, is it going to hold up? If they're making baby toys, there's a lot of toxins that are not supposed to be in those toys, right? So I think Etsy there, it doesn't necessarily take on insurance to provide for their sellers, but they have always from step A emphasized to their sellers in that case that they are running a small business.
I tried to find out how Josephine fit into Berkeley food safety regulations, and I asked the founders, who told me, well, every cook has to have a California food handler certificate, which sounds great until you find out that that's a 15-minute online test. So I totally, there are consumer vulnerabilities with all these services. The reason why I don't think it's as big a deal as what's happening to workers is the brand vulnerability of these services to disappointing a consumer is really costly. If a service like Josephine is starting out and someone gets food poisoning early, that goes all around Facebook, and that's a big blow. People take what happens to the consumer very seriously. They are not taking what happens to the worker very seriously. You're not judging these services on how much the cook is getting paid to serve this food. You're judging it and whether the food tastes good to me and doesn't make me sick. So when we're trying to figure out the larger societal concerns here, the consumer part, you know, if the company doesn't serve the consumers, the company's in trouble. But if it exploits the workers, the company makes more money.
Maybe this, actually, we are running out of time here. And the next panels are starting in 20 minutes. So I think we probably have to close. But thank you, everybody, for your wonderful presentations and for bringing in all these different angles. Thank you very much for everybody.